And I'm so excited to keep going with this rerouting series. If you want to follow along, we are going to be in Galatians chapter 2 this morning. A couple weeks ago, we started this new series working through the book of Galatians. Paul is writing this letter to a bunch of churches in the region of Galatia, and what he's telling them is, you have gotten off track. And so he's sending this letter to them to get them back on track, back on the gospel message, and make sure they haven't got their understanding of the Bible, their understanding of Christ, their understanding of their own salvation's messed up. Now, what we've been learning about them is it hasn't told us exactly what the problem is just yet, but he has said that you guys there in Galatia, you have went after another gospel. You have messed up, and since the gospel means good news, he said it's actually not good news at all when you start changing the good news of Jesus Christ. Now, this is good for you and me because honestly, even though we have doctrinal standards and even though we're very well routed in the Bible, within our hearts, can we not also get off track from time to time? It's very easy for us to do that. So we're going along with the Galatians here and learning just like they were what Paul has to teach us. Now, last week we started looking at Paul's resume. Paul is very thorough in explaining what he has to the Galatians. He doesn't walk in and say, you're doing this wrong and you're doing this wrong. He starts off by saying, this is how you know that you can listen to me. Here's my resume. I was called by God, to work by God, to mirror His image. And then he goes on and he starts telling a story in the middle of chapter 1 about where he went from the time that he was saved and how he traveled through these different different areas preaching the gospel. And the point of the whole story of the end of chapter 1 is that I didn't get a message or a directive or the gospel from the apostles. I got it from God, and it was years before I actually went to the other apostles and was working with them. And so that's where we're picking up. He's in the middle of this story. We're going to read verses 1 through 10 here in Galatians chapter 2. And he's in the middle of telling everything that God had done. He went and talked to them a few times, and then he left. He left the apostles, and then this is where he is. It says 14 years later. Then 14 years after I went up again to Jerusalem with Barnabas and took Titus with me also. And I went by revelation and communicated unto them that the gospel which I preach among the Gentiles, but privately to them which were of reputation, lest of any means I should run or had run in vain. But neither Titus, who was with me, being a Greek, was compelled to be circumcised. And that because of false brethren unawares brought in, who came in privately to spy out our liberty, everybody say liberty, which we have in Christ Jesus, that we might bring us into bondage. Everybody say bondage. To whom we gave place by my pulpit's falling apart. To whom we gave place by subjection, no, not for an hour, that the truth of the gospel might continue with you. But these who seem to be somewhat, whosoever they were, it maketh no matter to me, God accepteth no man's person. For they who seemed to be somewhat in conference added nothing to me. But contrariwise, when they saw that the gospel of the uncircumcised was committed unto me, as the gospel of the circumcision was unto Peter. For he that wrought effectively in Peter to the apostleship of the circumcision, the same was mighty in me towards the Gentiles. And when James, Cephas, and John, who seemed to be pillars, perceived the grace that was given unto me, they gave me and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship, that we should go into the heathen, they to the circumcision. Only they would that we should remember the poor, the same which I was also forward to do. So Paul is telling this story about what he did. He's not actually telling the Galatians anything just yet. He's just saying, it's like, listen, you've probably heard this story about how after I moved around and I preached and probably planted a future, after 14 years, I felt like I needed to go back to Jerusalem. And he talks about this conversation he was having with the other apostles. And it's talking about John, Peter, and James specifically. Now, if we're going to understand this story, point number 1 this morning is we need to go ahead and understand the new characters in this story. New characters. So Paul is saying, here's what I was doing, and he introduces to us 2 people that he was working with and walking with. The first one he introduces to us is Barnabas. Barnabas and Paul were pretty close. They also, as a southerner would say, they also butted heads from time to time. But Barnabas was with him when he went on this particular journey to Jerusalem. Now, it also tells us of a young man named Titus. Titus is a close friend of Paul's, and he moves around with Paul quite a bit. And Paul, in other books of the Bible, especially in Corinthians, he talks about his relationship with Titus, how Titus brings him strength and is with him quite a bit. But Titus has something different than all of the other Christians that we've talked about at this time. Titus is what we call a Gentile. which a Gentile is just someone who is not a Jew. He's one of the few people mentioned in the Bible who did not go from being a Jew to a Christian. He was brought in from another religion that was outside of the old Jewish order. And so Titus being there is going to be very important to what he has to say. You also see Paul writes a letter to Titus later on, makes it into the Bible. So we're looking at all of these men who had been Jews, and then there's just one guy mentioned here who's a Gentile, and that's Titus. And Paul says that as he was traveling, he was led by God. He said, I went by revelation. Nobody called me. Nobody told me to come there. He said, I was doing what God asked me to. And when Christ came to me, he said, you need to go to Jerusalem and do some things. Paul and Barnabas and Titus went on this journey. Now, the time that he showed up is recorded in Acts chapter 11. We're going to read it, but I'll tell you about what's going on. There is a great famine going on in Israel at this time that Paul shows up in Jerusalem. And he went there specifically not to preach, not to correct anybody, not to do anything. He went there specifically to take them food and supplies to the church at Jerusalem. By this time, the church at Jerusalem was numbering in the thousands. And if you read through the book of Acts, you see that the church at Jerusalem had actually sold most of their possessions and given their money to the church. And they're living just as a church and as a community, taking care of each other. And then this time of famine strikes. And that's when God comes to Paul and says, you go and you take supplies to them and you take things that they need and take care of them. Now, we see something interesting here between Paul and the apostles and the church of Jerusalem and all these churches around, is that there was a closeness among the churches and a closeness among Christians. Nobody was saying, hey, you take care of you and I'll take care of me. My church takes care of us, you take care of you. When there was a church in trouble, when the church of Jerusalem was struggling and the people there had needs, other churches from around sent supplies through Paul to help them. We still do that today. That's why we send money to missions to take care of missionaries who are planting churches, who are out spreading the gospel through different means. So it's very interesting that this early church, they were taking care of each other, and the purpose of that is not that they were trying to win something or earn something. They were all committed to the same message. They were all committed to the same purpose. It wasn't about Ramsey Heights and then the churches in Searcy. It wasn't about the country churches versus the city churches. It wasn't about your church is bigger than my church. It was about this. We're all working for the same purpose. It's about the kingdom of heaven, or the kingdom of God, as the Bible puts it. And so these churches were willing to take care of each other and sacrifice just strictly for the sake that we're all slaves to the gospel. That's what we're here to do, and our resources are used for that regardless of where they're used at. The second point we're going to look at here is that even the early church, even with this closeness among Christians, there was conflict and misunderstanding among Christians. Conflict and misunderstanding among Christians in the early church. Now, as Paul gets there, he walks into this fight. He goes to Jerusalem. He brings supplies. Everybody's happy to see him. It's Paul who has this great reputation. And he walks into the middle of Jerusalem, and they're experiencing some church turmoil. That's not something that just happens today. The church in Jerusalem was really fighting, and they were fighting over some doctrinal things. And so Paul shows up, and he's going to be, I don't think it was an accident that he's going to be there. Now, what we need to understand about this area is full of Jews, and they're having problems letting go of some of their old Jewish law. They've accepted Christ, they're saved, they believe in the grace of Jesus Christ, but they're still trying to take their old customs and their old traditions, and they're putting Christ in a box and saying, these are the things you have to do to be Christian, because most of them were Jews. And basically what they were saying is that if you want to be a Christian, you must first become one of God's chosen people. You must become a Jew, and then you can become a Christian. And some people were saying that that was necessary because they had lived under Jewish law all of their life. And then there were some people saying, no, that's not how it happens. If you're a Gentile, you go straight to Christ. You don't have to make your way through Judaism. And so Paul walks into the middle of this argument as they're trying to figure this out. And most specifically, this is coming about in the form of saying that Gentiles, people like you and I, need to be circumcised. Now this comes from Genesis chapter 17. God comes to a man named Abraham. There's a lot of history here. God comes to a man named Abraham, and he says, I want to make a covenant with you. And a covenant is a promise, or I think of it more as a contract. I want to make a covenant with you, Abraham, that you and your generations and all the people that follow you, they will be my chosen people forever. Everlasting covenant is what Genesis 17 says. And Abraham says, well, that sounds good. We want to follow you. I'm a devout follower of you, God. And God says, okay, well, here's your part of the covenant. In order to show your faith in this covenant, to participate in this covenant, your men must be circumcised. Now, we're not going to go into the gory parts of that, but that was part of how people showed they're accepting of God's promise, their place in the covenant. And so to these Jews, this was very important. They had grown up all of their life, and they said, what makes you set aside, what makes you special, what makes you loved by God is that you are a Jew, and you bear this mark of circumcision, which is what makes you set aside by God. And so when Christ comes through and he says, okay, that's not necessary anymore, you don't have to do that, some of these Jews who had grown up all of their life thinking, this is what makes me special, this is what makes me close to God, this is where my righteousness is found, they were having a hard time giving it up. And they were trying to force other believers who had not been Jews to take that mark. But Jesus changed everything when they come, and they are fighting over this. They've got those who understand and those who don't. And here comes Paul. And Paul offers two things to this fight. Number one, we learned last week, Paul had been a Jewish scholar before he became a Christian. Nobody could fight Paul on his knowledge of the law. He was excellent at it. So all of the Jews were excited. Here comes Paul. Paul will tell you that this is necessary. He had a complete knowledge of this. Secondly, this discussion wraps around the Gentiles. What should the Gentiles do? Should they be circumcised or should they not? Well, guess who is the only one who is going out and moving around the Gentiles and preaching the gospel to them? It's Paul. And so they say, okay, Paul, with your knowledge of Jewish law and your understanding of grace towards the Gentiles, could you tell us, do they need to do this? And Paul's telling us the story how he had this. He says he talks to some of them publicly, he talks to some of them privately, and he's able to give his take on it. And he says, it's not necessary because that's works, and works doesn't save you. People are saved by, the word is, grace that we've talked about. And he's able to set some of these that have gotten a little off track, and he's able to tell them, no, you're wrong. And of course, we know that the apostles were right in this. But he's able to come in as an outsider and give this gospel. Now, here's what I love about this story. He says, while I was doing this, while I was having this discussion, there sits Titus the whole time, and he is sweating bullets, because what are they fixing to do to him if Paul can't convince them they're wrong? He's the only Gentile in the room. They're going to start saying, okay, Gentiles have to be circumcised, and they're going to grab the first one that they can find and say, that's what you got to do to be a Christian. And Titus is sitting in the back of the room going, I hope Paul wins this. But Paul says, listen, Titus was there with me. He was a Gentile. He was there at the church. He was with me. And the elders of the church, the pastors, the apostles, they all agreed with me. We're all in agreement that this issue is dead, and I can prove it because Titus was there in their presence, and they did not compel him to try to do this. They didn't say it was necessary for his salvation. And Titus goes, whew. But he's putting this out here, and the question is, why is he telling this story? That's a lot of history and a lot of information. Why is this story important? Well, these churches in Galatia, when he's writing this letter, are having that exact same fight. Jewish pastors have left Jerusalem, and they've come out there and they've started giving them this other gospel that yes, you can be a Christian, but first you must take the mark of circumcision. And Paul's setting them straight. He says, look, we've been there. We had this discussion. I was in the church of Jerusalem where all of the apostles are. We discussed this, and it's settled. It's clear. This is not necessary that you should have to do this, that you should have to follow this religious law in order to be saved. It's over. Now, 2,000 years later, we still have that fight in churches. We still have that misunderstanding in churches, and it's not about the circumcision, it's about what marks make you a Christian. There are people out there that will tell you that if you want to be a Christian, you had better be baptized. And not because it's the right thing to do, but because your baptism will save you. That you can't be saved, that you can't experience faith and grace without baptism is when you actually get saved. Biblically, that's not true. Paul would sit here and he would say, no, that's works. It's just like circumcision. There are people out there that will tell you, you have to be a member of a certain church in order to be saved. And if you're not a member of that church, salvation is off limits to you. And Paul would say, no, we've had this fight. It's not about those kind of things. It's about the grace of God. There are people that will tell you have to eat a certain way, dress a certain way, look a certain way, talk a certain way in order to be saved. And all of that is untrue. It is by grace alone that we are saved. And that's the argument Paul is having to make, and he's being very thorough so there's no confusion. And we still get confused. But he's being very thorough in this argument is by grace alone. Now let me back up, because Paul gets here in a little bit. Now these things that I just talked about, the certain church and the baptism and making sure that you act, those things are important. I'm not saying that we can do whatever we want to do, but I'm saying it doesn't save you. When you're saved, God will change you to act a certain way, and He will lead you to be baptized, identifying yourself as a Christian. But it's not what saves you, and it's not what we need to teach people that saves you. And so all of these are important, but Jesus saves. And this brings us to the third point and the biggest one. Religious law is like being in bondage. We'll say that again. Religious law is like being in bondage. When we talk about these things that people say, it requires this to get to Jesus Christ. It requires this to get God. To stand before God and be justified, you have to do X, Y, and Z. That is religious law. See, these Jews had lived in all of their life under what we call simply the law. And the law was what God had given to the Jews, that this is the law of perfection. You hold it to the best that you can, and that's what makes you righteous before God, is you uphold the law. And it was a list of rules that you had to follow and ways you had to atone for your sin. And they were holding on to this law, saying, this is what makes us special. This is what gives us righteousness, is because we find perfection in the law, is what they were actually feeling, whether they believe it or not. But Jesus made it very clear when He was walking. He spoke to Jews on this exact topic. He said, it is impossible to be perfect. It is impossible to be perfect. And so Paul talks about these people bringing these ideals into this church. He says, first, they're false brothers. He said, they're not even Christians bringing these ideals in here. And he says, they have come to spy on our liberty. We're going to use the word freedom. It means the exact same thing. They've come to spy on our freedom and bring us into bondage. Well, what is bondage? What does it mean to be brought back into bondage? Well, bondage holds you back, and we typically think of bondage like being chained up. And it keeps you from going places. And so Paul talks about this religious law as being bound and chained and tied up and put together in this bondage of religious law. See, if we follow religious law, it binds us to this ideal that we have to be perfect. And because it binds us to this ideal that we have to be perfect, that is an impossible task. You cannot be perfect. I love you dearly, but the only good thing about you and the only good thing about me is Christ in us. And when we look at the gospel and when we look at the message of Christ, and there are ways that we are called to act and right and wrong, and I don't want to do that, but when we start saying, I've got to do this to be saved, I've got to do that to be saved, it ties us to this ideal that I have to be perfect, that my salvation rests upon me, and it puts us in this bondage that holds us back. And so long as we're like this, we never, ever get to experience Christ the way He meant for us. Listen, Christianity, the world has got it wrong because they think it is about religious goodness and they think it's about following rules. Christianity was not meant to be heavy and hurtful. Christianity was meant to set us free. Christianity was meant to set us free from the sin of the world. It was meant to take care of us. It was meant to give us something that we don't deserve, not call us to look at our own righteousness and our own goodness. I don't know if you heard the song that was playing during the meet and greet. It had been on my mind all morning, and I was standing up here talking to Brother Danny, and the song just came on. And it's Amazing Grace, My Chains Are Gone. And it talks about what it means to be a Christian. It says, my chains are gone. I've been set free. My Christ, my Savior, has ransomed me. And like a flood, His mercy reigns. Unending love, amazing grace. That is the truth of the gospel. That's the truth of what we're here to learn. And that's why we celebrate Jesus Christ. Listen to what the Bible says about salvation. 2 Corinthians 3:17. Now the Lord is that Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. John 8:36. If the Son shall set you free, ye shall be free indeed. Galatians 5:13. For brethren, you have been called into freedom. Galatians 5. Stand therefore in the freedom wherewith Christ hath made us free. And be not entangled again with the yoke of bondage. See, if you're unsaved, this is what sin looks like to you. You're chained to it. It defines you. Because when we die and we stand before a holy and perfect God, there's going to be a list of you messed this up and you messed that. And so this keeps you from getting to God, the sin. But when we're saved by God's grace, when we're saved by His amazing grace, God said, those chains that keep you from getting to me, those are gone. I've given you freedom. You're not supposed to bear that heavy weight. But we as Christians, whether we have the doctrinal stance of it right or not, we as Christians come back and we say, I was given freedom, but I keep tying myself up with this concept of I've got to be good enough for God. Oh, I messed up, said a dirty word. Gosh, God must be really upset with me. Lost my temper. God must be really upset with me. I just can't find a way out of this sin. I'm addicted to it. And when we try to get to God, it holds us back to Him because God says, I wanted you to come to me free. My grace covering your sin and not have to worry about it. See, He set us free from this. He died so that we wouldn't have to be bound by these things. We wouldn't have to be bound by perfection. And we as Christians, we can go to Christ freely and say, God, I messed up again. I know it's the 19th time today and it's only 11 a.m. But God, I messed it up again. And He says, it's forgiven. There's grace. And that's all that matters. Now, this is not a license. Paul gets into this later in the scripture. This is not a license to live however you want to live. I don't want it to sound like that. But how many of us have that sin or those sins that we feel like we just can't get rid of? And they just come back. And I just feel like such a failure before God. God, I can't be perfect. He says, I know. That's why I sent Jesus. That's why I ransomed you. Because you can't be perfect. And it's okay. I will change you and I will make you holy and I will set you apart, but I never expect you to be perfect. I have grace and forgiveness for you. With a message like that, why would we keep going back to bondage? Why would we keep going back to saying, this is what makes me holy? Being a member of this church or my baptism or my actions or the things that I've never done, and then that means the things that I have done make me unholy. Why would you ever give that up? But Christians throughout history, even starting in the early church, when people who walked in the footsteps of Jesus are there instructing them, they keep picking up this bondage and going, nope, I'm going to tie myself up with this law. I'm going to make sure that my sin weighs heavy on me and it keeps me from experiencing God the way He wanted me to. Why do we keep going back to that? It's because we go back to what we find familiar. One of my favorite TV shows. You guys ever seen the Beverly Hillbillies? Boy, this took a turn real quick, didn't it? You guys ever seen the Beverly Hillbillies? If you haven't seen it, it's this great old show, black and white show, and it's about these hillbillies that live in Arkansas in the Ozarks, and they have this little one-room cabin, and they're poor, and they don't have enough food, they don't have enough clothes, and they strike oil, and they get rich. And they go live in Beverly Hills among the superstars and the movie stars and all that. My favorite character is Granny, little fiery southern woman. I had an Aunt Sue, I think was Granny's twin. Granny living in this mansion with everything you could ask for, more money than they could ever spend. About every third episode, she'd start yelling, I want to go home. I want to go back to that little one-room cabin where we didn't have heat, where we didn't have air conditioner, where we didn't have food. Because it was familiar to her. Not because it was better, because it was familiar to her. She even sings a song, I'm lonely and blue and miserable too, because she couldn't go home. Jesus tells us, I've got for you a mansion of freedom. I've got a mansion of freedom for you. It's you're free from the sin. You don't have to carry the weight of that. You're going to mess up, but it's okay. Just keep looking to me. And you and I, in our hearts, we keep going back to, no, I want the one-bedroom cabin of religious law. I want to earn my salvation. I want to be good enough for God. And it doesn't work that way. We can't be good enough for God. And it just chains us and keeps us from experiencing Him. Now you're saying, Brian, how do I know? How do I know if I'm living religious law? How do I know if I'm bound by that sin? And then we're all sitting here, it's like, Brian, I know Jesus saved me. I've got this under control. I know I can't save myself. But even Christians, Paul is writing this to Christians. He's not writing this to people and said, you horrible people, you're complete. He's writing this to Christians. He said, you're off track. Look at how people who were bound by religious law expressed it. They tried to push it on other people. The people that were coming up with this law that Gentiles needed to be circumcised in order to be Christians were not Gentiles. They were people who was already circumcised. So my question to you, if you're living under religious law, is how do you judge other people? Do you look at people and say, I'm better than them? Or I can't believe they would act that way, or I would never do that. While we may be saved by grace, because that's the only way to get saved, we can start to put that religious law in our heart, and it'll show up in us because we'll start to put religious law on other people. I had a discussion one time about a pastor that had been related to me in some way, and I was talking with someone, and he had actually died in a place. He was trying to reach people that were unreachable here in America, and he had died, probably got robbed and been killed for the money that he had. And I was like, man, he really loved Christ. And the person I was talking to goes, I went to high school with him. I don't know if he was ever really a Christian or not. Well, what? He was a pastor, and he died in a place where he was trying to reach people that most people wouldn't go. And I said, yeah, but in high school, he was one of those. I don't know if God can get past that. See, that's religious law being forced on other people. That's the act of goodness and perfection being forced on other people, and that's how we can know if we're living that in our heart. It's easy for us to do. Being a Christian is supposed to be freeing for us, but there are days when it's tough. There are days when we aren't able to completely do what God has called us to do. And I think that we end up taking a lot of pride in the fact that we try really hard to do what God has asked us to do. But then we start to take that as our religion, that my religion is good, that I don't do this and I don't do that. And so we start to look at other people and say, you can't have grace unless you do the same things that I do. I've got a question for you this morning as we end this service. What sin do you feel like binds you? The one that you can't get rid of, and you wouldn't stand up here in front of everybody and say it, but you feel like it comes back again and again and again. And when it does, you feel like you're not good enough for God. I'd invite you up here this morning to come pray about that and just give it to God. God, I know your grace covers that sin. God, I know your grace covers me. And God, I don't want to be in bondage to this anymore because you died to set me free.